February 8, 1944, somewhere over northern France. 25,000 feet above a frozen landscape strangled by war. The sun was barely visible through the high-altitude haze. Ice crystals clung to the edges of the canopy, and every breath that hit the oxygen mask left a trail of frost. Inside the cockpit of an Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Hans Becker adjusted his trim and scanned the horizon. He had flown this route dozens of times. Another day, another interception, another chance to prove, once again, that the Luftwaffe still ruled the skies. His gloved fingers tapped the control panel rhythmically. Everything looked normal. Fuel was stable, guns loaded, formation intact. The radio crackled with coded chatter from the other pilots in his staffel. Veterans, like him, men who had survived Stalingrad, who had faced Spitfires over the Channel, who had shot down B-17s in waves and returned home without a scratch. They were proud, they were sharp, and above all, they were confident. But something felt different today. He couldn't name it, not yet. It was a tension in the air, a weight pressing against his instincts. He brushed it off, just nerves. The high command had warned them. The Americans were increasing their bombing raids. New strategies, more planes. So be it. They dealt with worse. Then he saw it. Far in the distance, like a shimmer against the horizon, a shape emerged. Not one, not a group, a wall. At first it looked like a cloud bank, thick and layered, but clouds don't glint in the sun. Clouds don't hum with that low, mechanical growl that drills into your chest. As the formation approached, Becker's eyes narrowed. The air grew heavy. His squadron grew quiet. It wasn't just bombers. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, flying tight, rigid, wings locked together in geometric precision. But surrounding them, above and below, and flanking on both sides, were smaller silhouettes. Dozens more, sleek, fast, like hawks circling a herd of elephants. But these hawks weren't waiting to strike. They were there to kill anything that tried. Becker cursed under his breath. P-51 Mustangs, the new ones, the ones that were supposed to be limited to short-range operations, the ones they mocked not 2 weeks earlier. Now they were here, in strength, in numbers, over France, flying deeper than ever before. He had no time to process what this meant. The radio snapped to life. Multiple voices, confused, alarmed. Reports were coming in from other units, formations, encountering heavy resistance even before reaching the bomber stream. Mustang patrols picking off interceptors in pairs, in threes, climbing out of the sun and disappearing before anyone could react. Not defensive, aggressive, surgical. Becker gripped the stick tighter. The old tactics were simple. Hit the bombers after the American fighters turned back. Their fuel would run low, they'd head home, and the sky would open up. That's when the Luftwaffe moved in. Tear through the vulnerable. Formation. Get out before the second wave. That had been the game. But this was a new game, and it had new rules. He signaled his men to tighten formation. Every pair of eyes locked onto the growing wall ahead. It kept coming. No cracks, no gaps, no stragglers. Just a slow-moving fortress, layered with firepower, guarded by a swarm of deadly escorts. The bombers alone were terrifying. B-17s, B-24s, heavy armor, high altitude, and a dozen 50-caliber machine guns on each one. A single pass through their defensive zone could rip wings clean off a fighter. But now, with the Mustangs, the Americans weren't just defending their bombers. They were hunting the hunters. Becker remembered a phrase one of his instructors had said back in 1941. The bomber will always get through. It had been a bitter joke, a relic of outdated doctrine. But now, staring down this new formation, Becker felt the weight of those words return. The bombers would get through, because now they had ghosts guarding them. He tilted his head slightly and caught a glimpse of sunlight reflecting off one of the Mustang canopies. The pilot was banking slowly, confidently, like a predator in no rush to strike, just waiting, watching. That's when it hit him. This wasn't just a mission. It wasn't even a battle. It was a statement. The Americans were no longer probing. They weren't testing limits or looking for weak spots. They had brought their full weight into the sky. Not recklessly, not hastily. Deliberately. Becker could feel it. He wasn't facing another sortie. He was witnessing a shift, a tectonic moment in the war. For years, the Luftwaffe had danced in and out of the clouds, outnumbered but not outclassed. They had used speed, precision, and superior tactics to hold the line. But this was something else entirely. This was momentum, the kind that doesn't stop, the kind that crushes you, not because it's smarter, but because it never runs out, because it replaces every loss with 3 more machines, because it doesn't care who the ace is, because it has no face, no name, just factories, blueprints, oil, steel, and suddenly, it wasn't just the cold or the altitude making his fingers tremble, it was recognition. They had mocked the Americans for their inexperience, laughed at their clumsy formations, called them milk bottle squadrons. But what Becker saw in front of him was not a joke. It wasn't a milk bottle, it was an avalanche. And no matter how skilled you were, no matter how fast or brave or lucky, you couldn't outfly an avalanche. He gave the order to hold formation, but deep down, he knew today would be different. Today, the Luftwaffe would not be intercepting. It would be surviving. What Becker didn't yet realize was that the Luftwaffe wasn't just facing a superior formation, it was facing the future. A future built not on aces, but on assembly lines. If you're still with us, take a second to support this project by subscribing and leaving a comment. Your voice keeps these stories alive. In the weeks leading up to that February morning, the confidence inside the Luftwaffe had begun to harden into something more dangerous than arrogance. It became assumption. For years, German fighter pilots had flown under the belief that the sky, despite the growing American presence, still bent to their will. Sure, there were more bombers now, more raids, but tactics still worked, experience still mattered. The high command still trusted the veterans, and, above all, the Reich still believed in the myth of its invincibility in the air. In countless briefings across airfields scattered through occupied Europe, young German pilots were taught to believe in the same rhythm. American bombers were slow, predictable, and most importantly, vulnerable. Their escorts, the P-38s and P-47s, could not follow them deep into the Reich. Fuel constraints meant the Americans had a leash. If you waited long enough, they would have to turn back. That window, that crucial moment when the bombers were naked, was where the Luftwaffe lived. Fast, coordinated strikes. Dive in from above. Tear the formation apart. Climb back out. Repeat. It worked for a time. So when whispers started to circulate that the Americans were sending fighters farther than ever before, few believed it. And those who did laughed. They called the P-51 Mustangs the flying milk bottles. Too sleek, too light, too American. Good for chasing messengers, maybe. Not over France, but not for real combat. Over Berlin. Veterans like Hauptmann Dieter Müller had over 80 confirmed kills. He'd downed his first B-17 in 1942. He could recite the weak points of a flying fortress in his sleep. He'd trained dozens of new pilots who idolized him. And to them, Müller would say, "Let them come. They'll fly home before they even reach us." Except now, they weren't flying home. They were staying. And they were not waiting to defend. They were attacking. Reports began filtering in from the lines that made even the most hardened German commanders pause. Mustang squadrons had been spotted not only near the bomber streams, but well ahead of them, sweeping the skies clean of potential interceptors hours before the main formation arrived. It was called fighter sweep, a brutal preemptive tactic that turned offensive air superiority into a surgical tool, and the Germans had no answer for it. One mission in late January saw an entire group of Bf-109s ambushed by Mustangs before they even reached cruising altitude. Half were shot down before they could form up. The rest scattered, never engaging the bombers at all. This was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a strategy, one they had not anticipated. But the most alarming shift wasn't happening in the skies. It was happening inside the minds of the pilots themselves. There had always been a certain pride in being outnumbered. German fighter aces like Galland, Hartmann, and Barkhorn were lionized not just for their kills, but for thriving against overwhelming odds. That myth fed the Luftwaffe's identity. One man, one machine, one mission, precision over numbers, instinct over planning. But what they were now facing in the air wasn't just quantity. It was a machine in itself, an airborne doctrine. American fighters were operating in packs, coordinated through radio systems that allowed formations to shift, rotate, and recover without losing cohesion. Their tactics were not glamorous. They were relentless, and that, more than anything, began to break the illusion. In one recorded engagement over the Ardennes, an American fighter group was ambushed by a numerically superior German force. By every metric, the Luftwaffe should have dominated. But the Americans adapted mid-fight. Instead of scattering or fleeing, they broke into smaller pods, using altitude and speed to cover each other, bait attacks, and regroup. The Germans claimed 3 kills. The Americans shot down 14. It was during this time that German pilots started describing the Americans not as inexperienced or clumsy, but as methodical, unemotional. One Luftwaffe officer wrote in his diary, "They no longer fight with ego, they fight with rhythm." This shift in perception was catastrophic. When fear enters a cockpit, it spreads like frost across the canopy. A hesitation in the turn, a delay on the trigger, a glance over the shoulder that lasts too long. Fear makes a pilot late, and late in the sky means dead. The young recruits, barely 19, many with under 30 hours of flight time, were the first to feel it. They had grown up hearing stories of Luftwaffe legends, but now they were being thrown into a sky where legends didn't matter, where the enemy didn't play by the old rules. In one case, a new pilot named Klaus Eberhardt returned from his first combat mission without firing a single round. He had lost his wingman in the first minute of engagement. The Mustangs came fast and low, and he had no time to orient himself. He landed, shaking, and was met with silence from the ground crew. His instructor simply said, "You lived. That is enough today." It was subtle at first, a few aborted sorties, a few too many engine failures on the runway. Then it became impossible to ignore. Morale was bleeding out of the Luftwaffe, not because the pilots had become cowards, but because they were smart, and they were starting to understand that what they were facing in the sky was no longer a rival. It was an inevitability. The arrogance that once filled the barracks now echoed hollow. When a German squadron returned after losing half its aircraft over central France, a mechanic asked the squad leader what had happened. The pilot looked at him, still strapped into his seat, blood drying on his forehead, and said only, "They are not escorting bombers anymore. They are escorting death." These were not just poetic words. They were battlefield truth. The Luftwaffe had always relied on precision, strikes, individual courage, and the elite edge of seasoned pilots. But the Americans had learned, evolved. They had turned the sky into a system, and now that system was grinding its gears over Europe. Still, High Command refused to accept it. Orders kept coming: scramble, intercept, destroy. But in the eyes of the pilots, the mission had changed. It was no longer about defending airspace. It was about surviving long enough to land. And the only question that mattered now, whispered
Hangars,
over, spoken in mess halls, etched into letters never sent, was this: how do you fight an enemy that never stops coming? If this story resonates with you, show your support by dropping a comment below and subscribing to the channel. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. The change did not arrive with fanfare. It came silently, subtly, hidden beneath the roar of engines and the thick veil of exhaust trails slicing across the sky. At first, the Germans noticed it only in fragments. A strange report from a reconnaissance flight, a bomber formation that seemed to have stayed covered too long, an encounter with enemy fighters farther east than anyone expected. Alone, these events meant nothing, but together, they were the early tremors of something colossal moving beneath the surface of the war. Until that moment, the Luftwaffe operated on a simple truth: American fighters had limits. They were deadly within a narrow window of range. Once that fuel gauge dipped too far, they would turn back, and the skies beyond would become the hunting grounds of the Reich. German tacticians knew this window like clockwork. Timing was everything. Wait until the escort peeled off. That was when you climbed. That was when you struck. But the Mustang broke the clock. At first, it looked like a fluke, a lucky push into deeper territory, a one-off mission with tailwinds or external help. But then, it happened again, and again. And suddenly, it was not the Americans adapting to the battlefield. It was the battlefield reshaping itself around them. The secret was elegantly simple and brutally effective. The P-51 Mustang, a a sleek and agile long-range escort fighter, had been paired with newly designed drop tanks, lightweight, disposable fuel containers mounted under each wing. These tanks extended the range of the Mustang far beyond what German strategists thought possible. Each tank held roughly 75 gallons of aviation fuel. Together, they added hundreds of miles to the Mustang's range. But more importantly, they could be jettisoned mid-flight. Once the fuel was spent, the tanks would be released and fall away, allowing the aircraft to regain its full performance. In combat terms, that meant the Mustang could fly deep into enemy territory, burn its external fuel while cruising, and then shed the extra weight to become a purebred dogfighter right when the fight began. It was like watching a heavyweight boxer step into the ring with full armor, only to tear it off in a single motion and strike with the speed of a featherweight. German pilots were caught completely off guard. In multiple engagements, interceptors dove in expecting to face sluggish American planes weighed down by distance. Instead, they found Mustangs that turned tighter, climbed faster, and dove harder than anything they had seen before. One Luftwaffe ace reportedly screamed into the radio during a dogfight, "These are not escorts, they are predators." The numbers told the story. Mustang with full drop tanks could fly over 1,600 miles round-trip. That meant they could now escort bombers from bases in England all the way to Berlin and back, with fuel to spare for combat. This changed everything. It erased the Luftwaffe's greatest advantage. There was no longer a safe window. There was no longer a moment where the bombers flew alone. The Americans had reached the strategic holy grail, continuous fighter coverage, from takeoff to target to home. And it was not just the key reach that terrified the Germans. It was the way the Mustangs fought. Unlike earlier American fighters, the P-51 was designed for high-altitude combat. Its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was a masterpiece of engineering. With its two-stage supercharger, it delivered consistent power even above 25,000 feet, right where the bombers cruised and where German fighters were most vulnerable. But this wasn't just about engineering. It was about synergy. The Americans had created a tool that blended seamlessly into their strategy. The Mustang wasn't just a fighter. It was a force multiplier. It allowed bomber crews to focus. It gave commanders more freedom to plan aggressive raids. It demoralized the enemy before a single round was fired. In one raid over the Ruhr Valley, German radar picked up a familiar bomber stream. Command scrambled interceptors, as usual. But when they reached the formation, they found the skies crawling with Mustangs. Dozens of them, weaving through the formation like guardian spirits. The Luftwaffe barely got within range. Several pilots were shot down before they could even fire. The rest turned back, their fuel wasted, their morale shredded. A German squadron commander later reported, "We did not fight that day. We fled." Even more devastating was the consistency. This wasn't a lucky day or a surprise tactic. It was the new normal. German defenses could no longer rely on fatigue or distance to save them. The Mustang erased fatigue. It erased distance. The Luftwaffe began referring to them with a kind of quiet dread. They were ghosts in the sky, machines that did not sleep, machines that did not break formation, machines that did not let go. Pilots who survived dogfights with Mustangs often did so through sheer luck, not skill. The P-51 could outclimb a Bf-109, outturn an FW-190, and outrun them both in a dive. But more terrifying than its performance was its discipline. The Mustang pilots rarely chased kills blindly. Pairs, they flew in units with layered support. They hunted like a pack, and when one fell, another filled the gap immediately. A Mustang kill was not just one aircraft down. It was a machine removed from a system that would immediately replace it. The Germans began studying the drop tanks in desperation. They tried to replicate the range by bolting extra fuel cells to their own aircraft, but it was never seamless. Their fighters weren't designed for it. The weight threw off balance. The aerodynamics suffered. It was a patchwork solution to a systemic disadvantage. Even more damning was that the Americans could afford to lose planes. The Mustang was cheap to build, easy to maintain, and produced in numbers that defied logic. By early 1944, factories in the United States were producing more aircraft in a month than the Reich could in a year. So each loss for Germany was permanent. A veteran shot down was one more irreplaceable piece of the Luftwaffe gone forever. But for the Americans, downed pilot meant another stepping up, another aircraft rolled out, another mission launched. The Mustang became more than a fighter. It became a symbol, a sleek silver blade that represented an empire of smoke, steel, and oil, a machine that embodied the terrifying reality of industrialized war. By the spring of 1944, German pilots no longer asked how far the Americans could fly. They asked when they would arrive. The bomber formations were no longer the threat. They were the bait. The danger flew above, below, and beside them. Wings full of .50 caliber thunder, engines tuned for altitude supremacy, radios chattering with perfect coordination. No hesitations, no cracks. In the German bunkers beneath charred runways and flickering bulbs, officers pored over maps and weather charts, trying to guess where the next wave would come from. But there was no guessing. There was only waiting. And in that silence before the storm, when the radar screen remained blank for just a moment, longer, they could only ask themselves a question that none of them dared answer aloud. What do you do when the sky is no longer yours? If these forgotten truths from the past move you, like they move us, support this mission by commenting your thoughts and subscribing. Let's make sure these stories are never erased again. March 6, 1944. A date written in ink across every operations board from the English coast to the heart of the Reich. The Allies had chosen this day to launch their boldest strike yet. The first full-scale daylight bombing raid on Berlin, escorted from takeoff to target by hundreds of fighters. A mission meant not just to damage the capital, but to shatter the myth of Luftwaffe control. Inside dusty hangars east of Hanover, pilots of Jagdgeschwader 11 and 54 were already awake. Cold air clung to the walls. Frost coated the noses of their Bf-109s. The mood was tense, but routine. Some smoked in silence. Others wrote final lines in worn journals, taping photographs of wives and children to the cockpit walls. They had done this 100 times. Scramble, climb, intercept, return, the rhythm of their war. But that morning, there was something else in the air, something heavier than the frost. At 05:30, radar stations began lighting up across the western edge of Germany, first in Calais, then Rouen, then Liège. The echo on the screens was unmistakable. It was not one formation. It was not two. It was a flood, a sky swollen with silver. Hundreds of B-24s, stacked in staggered waves, surrounded by tight swarms of fighters, moving with them like armored phantoms. At Luftwaffe command posts, red phones rang. Officers barked orders. Dispatchers relayed scramble codes. But as these instructions were passed down to the airfields, something happened. Or rather, something did not happen. Pilots hesitated. Not all. Not immediately. Some still ran toward their planes. Mechanics fueled and armed them like always. But in one gruppe after another, silence began to spread. It was not disobedience. It was something more dangerous. It was realization. The men who stood next to their fighters that morning had read the reports. They had seen the Mustang sweep patterns. They had heard the audio logs from pilots who never returned. Some had buried comrades who never even made it to altitude. And now they looked up at a sky that had once been theirs, and they no longer recognized it. The intelligence was clear. The Americans were not sending out isolated streams. This was a coordinated, fully escorted bombing run, stretching from southern England to Berlin. There would be no gaps, no windows, no moment of opportunity. And yet, the orders stood. Take off, climb, engage. Major Walter Dahl, commander of JG 300, reportedly walked into the ready room that morning and stared at his men in silence. He knew many of them by name, knew who had lost brothers, who had once dreamed of being architects or teachers. He knew what he was about to ask them to do, and he knew how it would end. But orders were orders, so he said what he had to say. 10 aircraft took off, 3 returned. At another airfield near Magdeburg, a ground officer noted in his logbook that a full staffel failed to launch. Their aircraft were ready. The weather was clear, but no engines started. The pilots remained seated in their briefing room, helmets in hand, staring at the floor. No words were exchanged, no protests made, just silence. Later, the I squadron leader submitted an official explanation. Engagement considered tactically impossible without additional coverage. That was the sanitized version. The truth was harder to put on paper. The Luftwaffe had reached a breaking point. These were not new recruits refusing to fight. These were hardened, battle-tested veterans. Men who had flown against Spitfires over Dunkirk, who had seen Russia from the cockpit. They were not cowards, but they were not suicidal either. They had done the math. They had seen the formations. They had heard the numbers. And they understood something that the top brass refused to accept. You cannot fight what you cannot reach. You cannot destroy what you cannot see. And you cannot win against a sky that never empties. Over Berlin that day, the Mustangs arrived first, not the bombers, the fighters. They flew high and fast, ahead of the wave, sweeping the air clean like a blade through silk. They took position above German airfields, diving on any aircraft that dared to lift off. It was not defense, it was control. Radio operators on the ground listened helplessly as squadrons were torn apart mid-climb. Some planes never made it past 5,000 feet. One pilot screamed over the radio, "They are already here! They are everywhere!" The bombers arrived shortly after. By then, resistance had collapsed into chaos. A handful of German fighters managed to penetrate the Mustang shield. Fewer still reached firing range. But the damage was done. Not the aircraft, to the psyche. That day, Berlin was hit hard. Dozens of buildings destroyed. Industrial complexes crippled. But what cracked wasn't made of concrete. It was made of belief. For the first time, Luftwaffe command had to admit the unthinkable. Their fighter arm was no longer dominant. Their skies, once a fortress, were now a corridor. And their pilots, the best in the world, had begun to ask the one question every military dreads. Why? Why climb into a cockpit when the odds against you were not but absurd? Why take off when the enemy was already above you, already watching, already counting down? Why follow an order that led not to battle, but to slaughter? German propaganda spun it as tactical withdrawal, as operational repositioning. But the truth slipped through in letters home, in memoirs scribbled decades later, in the confessions of pilots who could no longer lie to themselves. One of them wrote, "It was not that we were afraid to die. It was that we saw no reason to die for nothing." The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility did not collapse in flames. It crumbled in silence. No heroic charge, no final stand, just empty runways, silent radios, and the quiet refusal of men who had finally seen the edge of the cliff and chose not to jump. And so, in that stillness, a new kind of sound took over the sky. Not the scream of engines or the stutter of gunfire, but the endless, steady drone of American formation. A sound that no longer asked for permission. Sound that signaled the old world had vanished. If you believe these voices from history deserve to echo louder, help us preserve their memory by subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Every voice keeps their story alive. In the skies above Europe, two opposing worlds collided. One was forged in tradition, skill, and tactical brilliance. The other was born in smoke-belching factories, endless supply chains, and cold mechanical efficiency. One relied on a shrinking pool of seasoned veterans, flying aging machines with dwindling fuel. The other relied on spreadsheets, assembly lines, and pilots trained to fly not with glory, but with purpose. The Luftwaffe had always believed in the power of the individual. The German ace was not just a warrior, he was a symbol. Pilots like Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Adolf Galland became legends, each with hundreds of confirmed kills. Their skill was unparalleled, their instincts honed, their names known throughout the Reich. For them, combat was not just duty, it was art, it was personal. The doctrine reflected this belief. Germany's strategy favored small, elite formations, tactical flexibility, precision strikes. The idea was simple. One experienced pilot in a superior machine could defeat 3 average opponents. And for a while, it worked. But the skies began to change. And the new enemy did not care for duels. It did not care for honor. It did not play by the old rules. The American war machine was built, not around the brilliance of a few, but the reliability of many. The United States trained pilots in waves. Production facilities built aircraft in batches of hundreds. Logistics centers tracked fuel, ammunition, spare parts and personnel across oceans with military-grade mathematics. It was not romantic, it was not beautiful, but it was unstoppable. The P-51 Mustang itself was the perfect metaphor for this shift. Its design was refined, its engine was powerful, but what made it truly lethal was not what it did in a dogfight. It was what it allowed to happen. It extended the reach of the bomber fleets. It allowed for full escort from England to Berlin. It gave the Americans the power to grind down the Luftwaffe, one mission at a time. For every Focke-Wulf lost, Germany lost not just a machine, but a pilot, often one with years of experience and hundreds of hours of combat flight. For every Mustang shot down, the United States simply sent another, sometimes two. Early 1944, the math had turned cruel. On the German side, resources were drying up, factories were being bombed, fuel was being rationed, and pilots were being rushed into cockpits with barely enough training to survive takeoff, let alone aerial combat. What took American pilots 30 weeks to learn, Germans were now being forced to absorb in less than 12. Even their aircraft, once the envy of the world, were starting to suffer. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 were still deadly, but their production was fragmented. Variants rolled off different lines with slight differences in performance. Repairs were slower, parts were scarce, mechanics were overstretched. Meanwhile, American factories like the one in Inglewood, California, were producing Mustangs at the staggering rate of nearly 300 per month. The aircraft came out standardized, tested, and ready to fly. Ground crews operated with clockwork precision. Supply chains were so well-oiled that entire engines could be replaced overnight. Bombers damaged in France could land in England and return to service within 48 hours. This was not war as the Luftwaffe knew it. This was war as a process. War measured not in victories, but in volume. German commanders began to feel the pressure in ways numbers could not explain. It wasn't just the rate of losses, it was the rate of recovery. For every squadron that returned with 2 planes missing, another 2 would take their place the next day. But the Americans didn't just replace, they grew. By spring, the United States Army Air Forces were fielding more than 1,300 Mustangs in Europe alone. New airfields opened weekly. Fuel shipments increased. Intelligence networks became more sophisticated. Reconnaissance photography provided near real-time data. Missions were planned with a precision that left no space for improvisation. Every sortie was part of something larger. In the air, this industrial rhythm translated into tactical dominance. German pilots often described their American opponents as predictable in movement, but impossible to shake. The Mustangs would not chase recklessly. They did not bite at bait. They stayed in formation, protected each other, waited for the right moment, and when they struck in coordinated waves. It was not passion that gave them the upper hand, it was pattern. One Luftwaffe survivor, interviewed decades later, described his final mission like this: "I dove on a bomber, just like we were trained. I had a perfect line. Then they came. 1, then 2, then 5 Mustangs. I turned left. They turned with me. I turned right. They were already there. It felt like I was flying against gravity itself." Another pilot wrote, "They didn't fight like men. They fought like systems." What was left of German air superiority began to unravel. In meetings behind closed doors, high-ranking Luftwaffe officers argued over impossible choices. Should they protect the cities or the front lines? Should they save fuel for emergency defense or burn it in preemptive attacks? The Reich's remaining fighters were scattered across a collapsing front. No decision seemed to matter anymore. Wherever they sent aircraft, the Americans arrived with more. The psychological toll was devastating. Pilots no longer asked if they would make it home. They asked how long they could delay the inevitable. Veterans who had once led missions with fire in their eyes now flew with quiet resolve. They knew that survival was no longer about skill. It was about odds. Even the concept of the ace, once celebrated and revered, lost its meaning. Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace in history, downed over 350 aircraft. But in the final stages of the war, even he admitted that no amount of kills could reverse the tide. The skies were too crowded, the losses too constant. In letters intercepted by Allied intelligence, German pilots began to use a grim phrase, Himmel aus Eisen, sky of iron. It was no longer poetry. Was resignation. And all the while, the machines kept coming. Every mission flown by the USAF was backed by entire cities working in unison. Engineers, drivers, cooks, factory workers, planners. From women riveting wings in Detroit to children collecting scrap metal in Kansas, the entire nation had become a factory for flight. That was the true weapon. Not the Mustang, not the bomber, not the bullet. It was the rhythm. A rhythm that never skipped a beat. A rhythm that did not care about the brilliance of an ace or the courage of a commander. A rhythm that turned dreams into dust and legends into footnotes. If you're still with us, and this part of history speaks to something in you, consider leaving a comment and subscribing. These aren't just war stories. They're stories about systems, choices, and consequences that echo far beyond the battlefield. It began as a low murmur in the distance. At first, it was easy to mistake for wind. A faint vibration that slid along the concrete, tickled the skin, and vanished again. But the old mechanics at the airfields knew better. They would pause mid-step, tilt their heads, and narrow their eyes toward the west. That sound was not the wind. It was the approach, the drone of hundreds of engines moving in synchronized formation, the thunder of radial pistons beating in perfect time. It was the sound of inevitability, and for the Luftwaffe, it would soon become the soundtrack of despair. Across occupied Europe, civilians and soldiers alike came to recognize the American bomber formations not by sight, but by sound. You could hear them minutes before they appeared, a mechanical growl that rolled across hills and rivers and echoed through the cities like a storm cloud filled with steel. It was not the sharp scream of jet propulsion or the howl of a diving fighter. It was heavier, more deliberate. It moved with gravity, like footsteps coming down a long hallway. When the Mustangs joined those formations, the sky changed texture. The thunder gained an edge. Beneath the heavy hum of the bombers came the ripping snarl of the P-51s. Their Packard Merlin engines had a distinctive pitch, higher and more aggressive, almost impatient. Pilots described it as a mechanical growl, like a wolf pacing before the strike. The Germans called them whispering wolves. And for good reason. When the P-51s came in for the kill, they moved fast and low, sometimes silent until the last second. You would see only the sun reflecting off a canopy, a glint that appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. The enemy was no longer an object to be spotted in the distance. It was a shadow that arrived without warning. One German pilot recalled seeing his entire formation broken apart in under 90 seconds. 4 Mustangs had attacked in sequence, each coming from a different altitude, banking through the contrails like ghosts. The formation was disciplined, precise. Not a single bullet wasted. In the end, 6 German E-30 fighters were downed before a single defensive maneuver could be made. But even more haunting than the speed or firepower was the sound. The hammering rhythm of 650 caliber Browning machine guns firing in unison was deafening. It was a metallic roar that echoed through the fuselage and rattled the bones. Each burst sent streams of heavy lead tearing through aluminum skin, ripping apart cockpits, wings, and engines with horrifying ease. For Luftwaffe ground crews, the worst part wasn't the return of damaged aircraft. It was the absence of sound altogether. Sometimes a formation would scramble to intercept, and after takeoff, the radios would fall silent. No check-ins, no reports. Just static. Minutes would pass, then hours, and nothing. No engines in the distance, no parachutes spotted, just silence. It was a silence heavy with truth. The truth that the skies no longer belonged to Germany, that the war had shifted from contested to controlled, that entire squadrons could vanish without leaving a trace. A radar operator stationed near Stuttgart once said, "We used to listen for the enemy. Now we listen for the silence. And when the silence stays, we know." Veteran pilots could tell the difference between silence born from stealth and silence born from absence. And as more missions ended without reports, without landings, without returns, that silence grew louder. It wasn't just battlefield silence. It was the kind that seeped into halls of command, into strategy rooms, into whispers shared between generals behind closed doors. No one wanted to admit what was happening. but everyone felt it. A sense that the Luftwaffe was not losing air superiority. It had already lost it. This change began to affect decisions on the ground. Pilots delayed scrambles. Commanders hesitated to send replacements. Crews took longer to refuel aircraft, not out of laziness or incompetence, but because the rhythm had broken. The tempo that had once driven German air response, fast, aggressive, reactive, was now slow, reluctant, strained. And it wasn't just fear, it was fatigue. The psychological fatigue of fighting an enemy that never stopped coming, that adapted faster, that replaced faster, that operated with a kind of inhuman regularity, like clockwork, like a tide. This fatigue became contagious. Reports began to mention mental collapse among Luftwaffe pilots, not panic, but something more subtle, a creeping numbness. A pilot who returned from a mission without speaking a word, another who refused to wear his flight gloves, saying he no longer needed to feel the controls. A squadron leader who simply stood next to his aircraft one morning and never boarded. They were not breaking down from cowardice. They were breaking down from inevitability. Even within the ranks of German command, there was an unspoken shift in language. Briefings began to include phrases like minimal viability and containment zones. The focus turned from victory to survival, from air dominance to damage control. And while this was happening, the sound above never changed. The Mustangs continued to roar. The bombers continued to thunder. The air vibrated with American presence, and the silence below continued to spread. There was a mission over Leipzig that would become infamous among German airmen. A full bomber wave, escorted by hundreds of P-51s, approached in textbook formation. German fighters rose to meet them, and within minutes, the air was filled with tracers, explosions, spiraling debris. But then, the radios went dark. Every channel, every frequency. Command tried to raise the pilots. No answer. Then, one voice cracked through. "We are not going to make it." That was the last transmission received. 34 aircraft were lost. Only 4 returned. In the aftermath, the Luftwaffe command issued a statement praising the courage of the fallen and vowing retaliation. But among the pilots who had survived, the message was different. One wrote in his logbook, "We are flying into the jaws of something that does not feel anymore. It only moves forward." And that may have been the most terrifying truth of all. The Americans were no longer viewed as just an enemy. They were becoming a phenomenon, a force of nature. Their formations rolled over cities like thunderclouds. Their fighters struck with the speed of lightning, and their machine guns sounded like the rain of a storm you could not escape. What began as arrogance had become fear. What began as battle had become survival. If you believe these forgotten echoes from the past matter and deserve to be remembered, take a moment to share your voice in the comments and consider subscribing. Every click helps keep history alive. By the spring of 1944, the sky above Europe had changed forever. What was once a battlefield of dueling aircraft and daring pilots had transformed into something colder, heavier, and far more relentless. The Luftwaffe no longer controlled the air. They no longer even contested it. What flew above now was not a force of men. It was a machine, and that machine belonged to America. The shift did not happen in a single battle or in a sudden collapse. It happened gradually, like the temperature falling in a room where no one notices until they begin to shiver. German aces, once the pride of the Reich, were now flying beside teenagers barely trained, often in patched-together planes, with instructions that sounded more like wishes than orders. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition was limited. Aircraft parts were scavenged from wrecks, but the American formations kept coming. The sound of American bombers and escort fighters became as constant as the church bells they drowned out. The sky no longer roared in cycles. It hummed with permanence. The once mighty air arm of the Reich had become reactive, fragmented, overwhelmed. Pilots reported seeing formations so vast they seemed to blot out the sun, a canopy of wings and engines stretching from horizon to horizon. It was no longer about who had the better pilot. It was about who could outlast, and Germany had already lost that fight. The Mustang had become more than a fighter aircraft. It had become a symbol, Not just of American engineering or aerial dominance, but of a deeper, more terrifying truth, that wars would no longer be won by brilliance or bravery alone. They would be won by systems, by scale, by nations that could build, move, and rebuild faster than the enemy could react. And by 1944, the United States was operating on a level of industrial power the world had never seen. Factories in Michigan and California were producing planes faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Replacement parts were packed in crates before the previous aircraft even left the assembly line. Pilots trained in states like Texas and Georgia were arriving in England weekly, ready to step into any empty cockpit. And every time the Germans believed they had dealt a blow, they turned around to find not just recovery, but escalation. By May of that year, the statistics were devastating. In just 4 months, Germany had lost more than 2,000 aircraft. That included hundreds of veteran pilots, engineers, and support crew. In that same period, the USF had increased its bomber escort strength by nearly 30%. The Luftwaffe was not just being outmatched, it was being erased. And as the skies became more secure, the bombers flew deeper, longer, harder. Industrial targets that had once been considered unreachable were now being hit with precision. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin no longer feared the night alone. Daylight brought equal destruction. It was the daylight that broke morale. In the early war years, German civilians had clung to the idea that daytime meant safety, that bombings would only come under the cover of night, that life could continue with some sense of normalcy under the sun. But that illusion was gone. Now, even at noon, the air raid, sirens wailed, mothers pulled children from schools, workers abandoned factories, and all looked skyward, waiting for the silver swarm to arrive. The American war machine did not rest. It did not hesitate. It did not forget. And for the Luftwaffe, nothing was more chilling than watching the enemy fly without fear. Because fear had always been part of air combat. The uncertainty, the risk, the knowledge that every takeoff might be your last. But the Mustangs flew like they knew they were coming home. The bomber crews flew like they knew they would be met by fighters at every point of the mission. That confidence, that certainty, it changed the shape of the war. It did something that bombs and bullets alone could never do. It broke the will to resist. By late summer, Luftwaffe Command knew the truth. There were not enough planes, not enough fuel, not enough pilots. What remained of the fighter arm was being reserved for desperate defense operations, not to win the war, but to delay, defeat. And in that delay, the sky belonged entirely to the United States. American air dominance was not just a tactical advantage. It was a psychological victory. Every formation that crossed the sky was a declaration. We are still here, and we are not stopping. One German officer, captured near Aachen in 1945, said it plainly. There are no more battles. There is only pressure, constant pressure from the sky. That pressure would continue until the day Germany surrendered. And even then, Mustang remained in the sky, flying over liberated cities, protecting convoys, and reminding the world of who had claimed the heavens. The sky had once belonged to knights of the air, to duels and dogfights. But by 1945, it had been handed to those who could fill it completely. And it was filled by America. In the years that followed, former Luftwaffe pilots would speak not with bitterness, but with clarity. They did not blame the Mustang. They respected it, feared it, admired its power and precision. What they feared most in the end was not the plane, but what it represented. They saw a new kind of warfare, a war where industry became strategy, where the rhythm of machines replaced the instincts of men, where dominance was not a matter of heroics, but of mathematics. And in that new world, the Luftwaffe simply did not belong. By the end of the war, the skies of Europe no longer echoed with the names of German aces. They echoed with something else: the low rumble of factories, the mechanical chorus of mass production, the endless rhythm of steel and flight and fire. The sky had been claimed not by a single machine or even a single army, but by a nation that had mastered the art of turning will into weapon. If this story moved you, we thank you for taking this journey with us. History lives in details like these, in forgotten missions, in the silent decisions, in the skies that once belonged to no one, and were taken by everyone. Leave us a comment below. Let us know what part struck you the most. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel to help us keep these stories alive. Your voice matters here. And now, click on the next video appearing on your screen, because there's always another page in history worth discovering.